Most of the time I hear people talk about how broken Rotten Tomatoes is, it usually comes with a huge misunderstanding of what the critic score actually means. I've seen a lot of complaints that Rotten Tomatoes gives out biased scores to Marvel movies while DC movies get less than favorable scores, and this complaint doesn't really seem unfounded, right? After all, Man of Steel, Wonder Woman at 1984, and Batman v Superman all have a lower score than Thor the Dark World, which is the lowest scored MCU movie. Justice League Snyder Cut has a lower critic score than Iron Man 2, which is widely regarded as one of the weakest MCU movies. Therefore, Rotten Tomatoes is biased, and therefore Rotten Tomatoes is bad. Except you would be barking up the wrong tree with that assumption. All it takes is a little bit of research to realize that Rotten Tomatoes themselves don't actually dictate the movie scores. What Rotten Tomatoes actually is a review aggregate site that allows a roster of around 600 professional approved critics to submit their reviews to their website of a particular movie or show. Many of these reviews come with a review score tacked on, like 6 out of 10 or B+, or A- or whatever. But here's where people get confused. Black Panther does not have a 96% on Rotten Tomatoes because the average critic gave it a 9.6 out of 10, because that would be completely insane. Instead, the tomato meter demands that a critic submit a review with a binary question. Did you like the movie, yes or no? This is done quite simply because movie ratings are total arbitrary horseshit. If one person classifies 7 out of 10 as a masterpiece, another might classify 7 out of 10 as not particularly good. That score, unless you are familiar with a critic on an individual level and their rating system, it's not particularly helpful. However, that binary yes or no question is way more universally understood and far less arbitrary. So Black Panther's 96% does not mean that Black Panther is an irrefutable masterpiece. It instead means that if you sit down and watch the movie, you're about 96% likely to at least like the movie. It says absolutely squat about how much you will probably like the movie. Don't get me wrong, it's still not a perfect system. If you want the how much question answered, that's what you go to IMDb for. Now that we've addressed the movie score, we need to move on to the main argument of today, which is that the Rotten Tomatoes critic score for TV shows in particular is pretty frickin' broken. So how does the critic score for TV shows actually work? Well, it is a bit more layered and complicated. First, we need to identify the two ways critics can submit TV reviews on Rotten Tomatoes, and their advantages and disadvantages. There's the standard way that the movie reviews are submitted, where the entire season is rated positive or negative as a whole by the critic. You either like the season as a whole or you don't, simple as that. This type of scoring is useful for seasons that are dropped all at once. A good example of this is most Netflix shows where a critic can watch the entire season on the day of release and tell you whether or not they like the season immediately. However, then came along shows like Better Call Saul or pretty much any of the Star Wars or Marvel Disney Plus shows, which released one new episode on a week-by-week basis. And things get a little more complicated there. On one hand, you can't write one single sweeping review for the entire show on its day of release, because chances are that the show will begin to take its stride in the later episodes, and if that happens, then well done, you've just played yourself. However, at the same time, you can't just wait 6, 8, or even 12 weeks to form a complete opinion of the show as a whole, because the entire point of reviewing a movie is to tell your readers or viewers whether or not you recommend a movie or show. If you wait too long, then interest on the show will undoubtedly have plummeted. After all, discussion has come and gone, spoilers have flooded social media, so you need to form an opinion and do it fast. This is where episode by episode reviews come in. The concept is self-explanatory really. Every week, when a new episode drops, the critics will flock to Rotten Tomatoes and submit their positive or negative review for the latest episode. This means that critics are able to give a fair opinion right out of the gate, but it also means that they aren't judging the entire show on a single episode. The critic score takes every review from every episode and uses those to calculate the percentage of positive reviews. Rotten Tomatoes doesn't take the average score for each episode to determine the final tomato meter because that would give some reviews on the lesser reviewed episode more voting power over the ones on the higher reviewed episodes. Okay, maybe that was a bad example because the difference is pretty small, but just remember my point about equal voting power. That's what I want you to take away from this point. All votes should be counted equal. One minor flaw with this system is that your opinion of the previous movies might change depending on what you thought of the later episodes. I'm gonna cross into hot take territory here, but I didn't like The Mandalorian Season 2 as a whole, and I would have probably left a negative review if I was watching Season 2 as one complete entity. I thought the first 7 episodes were alright, with Episode 2 out of that roster not being very good, but then I really didn't like Episode 8, which exposed the weaknesses in most of the previous episodes. So 6 positives and 2 negatives still means that my overall score for the season would have been 75%, when if I would have been reviewing it as one complete item, it wouldn't have been anywhere near that high. But this is an unavoidable part of episodic material, even in movies of a franchise. Later movies may worsen your opinion on the older ones based on how the story evolves, and that isn't really an indictment on the episode or movie itself as much as it is an indictment of the evolution of the story itself. And it's quite frankly an issue that comes with the package. If you don't like that very much, then the idea of waiting till the season is over and then dropping a sweeping review might be more your cup of tea. Neither of these ways of calculating the critic review score is inherently bad, but they both have their ideal use cases. However, Rotten Tomatoes ended up making the tomato meter problematic by allowing these two review methods to coexist. Take the recent Disney Plus show The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. For most of its run, it boasted a very respectable 92%. This 92% score was calculated from the roughly 200 episode-by-episode reviews recorded at the time. However, the score one day suddenly jumped straight from 92% to 96%. So what happened? Was Rotten Tomatoes rigging the percentage because it wanted to appease Mickey Mouse? No, not quite. What happened is that 6 positive reviews dropped for the entire show as a whole, meaning that there were suddenly 2 tomato meter values instead of just the 1. If we look at the 6 positive reviews based on the entire show, then we have a 100% positive review score, but the 200 episode-by-episode critics totaled to a 92% score, and Rotten Tomatoes simply took an average of the two scores, giving us 96%. The score stagnated again for another week or so until episode 5 dropped, and then it dropped a full 7% to 89%. And the thing that caused it was a single critic giving the entire show a negative review. So let me get this straight. One critic was able to skew the opinions of a couple hundred critics by 7% just by voting in a different way to most of the others. 6% were able to skew those opinions by 4%. Remember my argument condoning the weighted average that the second score calculating system put forth? That may as well be tossed out the window now, because all of a sudden a very small minority of critics have a hugely disproportionate say in the poll, and that's a huge problem. Okay, it's all well and good pointing out a flaw in the system, but I can't expect things to be improved if I don't provide a better solution. But thankfully, I have 2 options to put forth if any employees at Rotten Tomatoes are indeed listening. My first proposal is to make it so that critics can only submit reviews for any given show through one of these 2 ways. If the show drops all at once, only allow reviews to be recorded for the show as a whole. If the show releases episodically, only allow reviews to be recorded for individual episodes. This helps every single review or vote to count equally and fairly towards the final tomato meter score. The other option is to keep both review options open, but for every review, whether posted under an episode or over the entire show, they enter a central pool where it is factored into one single percentage and not averaged together with any other percentages. This might seem like an inconsequential issue, but it is an issue that is very personal to me. We must continue fighting for a fair Rotten Tomatoes democracy, and anyway, do the subscribe thing and stuff so I might make another video in the next decade that isn't a shitpost. I don't know, bye.